die in order for the Civil War to continue. And the law was being contorted by Roosevelt in order to save the land. And they knew it, but they just felt they had no choice, given the high obstacles to achieving a noble goal. If you cross that fine line, then your leadership doesn't make no sense anymore. Somehow they were able to restrain themselves from crossing it, even though they contorted and manipulated the law to a certain degree. Another example would be Franklin Roosevelt in the Great Depression. As a history major, do you remember what percentage of Americans, right now, what percentage of Americans are unemployed? You remember they talk about that all the time?
I think like 8%.
Do you know how many Americans were unemployed in the Great Depression?
It's been a long time since I studied it, but I think.
Does anybody remember?
30.
It was over 30, yeah, it was close to a third of all American workers. It's truly remarkable. And Roosevelt had to do something about it. This has always been a highly individualistic country. An individualist doesn't like to be told what to do. And they especially don't like to be told what to do by the government. So what Roosevelt said was, I'm an American and I'm an individualist too. You have to remember, that was the Roosevelt family was one of the richest families in the country. They made their money through the China trade, unregulated China trade. They stole things out of China and brought them to the United States. And they said they stole them fair and square. So, but he said, these are unprecedented times. Never in American history had almost a third of all working people been unemployed. So he said, in unprecedented times, unprecedented methods had to be used. And so the first time in American history, the government started, under his leadership and his prodding, started putting very, very serious regulations on what Americans could do. At first, Americans weren't too happy. Of all the Americans, they go, who are the most individualistic of all Americans? What class of people? What group of people? The ones who don't want to be told what to do the most.
Class of people?
Yeah, not like middle class, but what, like occupation of people. Anybody?
Yeah, farmers.
It's the small farmers. I mean, you talk about individualists. These are people who throughout their lives, throughout the lives of their fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers, every day is a battle between just one person and their family and nature, uncontrollable nature. And it's all done on their backs, as it was done on their father and grandfather and great-grandfather's backs. So the irony was, as these hard-working small farmers were continuing to produce more and more crops, according to the law of supply and demand, they were making less and less money. People growing corn, wheat, the dairy farmers producing milk, peanuts, all the way down the line. They were making less and less money. They weren't able to pay their mortgages. Every year, farmers in the spring have to borrow thousands and thousands of dollars from the bank in order to buy seed, new machinery, or parts to fix their old machines that have broken and have used throughout the long winter. And the expectation is, just as for them in their lives, their father and father's fathers, that when they bring in the crop, they'll be able to pay back the bank. But as they're producing more and more crops, and by the law of supply and demand, they're making less and less money, they're unable to pay back the bank. And so more and more American farmers are losing their farms to the banks. So Roosevelt comes up with an unprecedented solution. You remember what it was? Do you remember what it was?
Price controls.
Subsidy.
It's subsidies. It's a kind of price control without putting it direct. So he had to force the farmers to produce less. Remember, these highly proud men and women and their children had to leave a significant part of their acreage fallow in order to make more money, in order to pay back the bank, in order to leave, in order to be able to continue to own their farms. Now, Asper, how do you suppose that worked at first, when Roosevelt tried to force through subsidies?
I'm not good.
They thought he was crazy.
Right.
They thought he was right, but they thought he was crazy. You want us to work less hard when our whole lives have been based on hard work? When we've depended only on our hard work? He said that's your only hope. So they passed the laws and forced them on these reluctant farmers. And much to their great surprise, it worked. But they could have never figured it out by themselves. What about George Washington? The greatest crises in American history have been the founding, because the country could have made it or not. The Civil War, because the country could have made it or not. It was just by a hair's breadth that we made it. How do you spell it? Hair's breadth, really. How do you spell that? I've heard that term over and over again.
Breadth, B-R-E-A-D-T-H.
Yeah, but how do you spell hairs?
H-A-I-R-S.
Yeah, I always thought it was the breadth of a rabbit. Yeah,
Okay.
but hair's breadth actually makes a lot of sense. The width of just one hair, we made it. So it's during the founding, right? 1788, when the Constitution was accepted in the country, was able to make it through the years of the Articles of Confederation. Civil War, 1861 to 1865, when the country was about to be dissolved. The Great Depression and World War II. These are the four main crises in American history. So we've dealt with Roosevelt, we've dealt with Lincoln, and now let's talk about Washington. What was he trying to, what noble goal was he trying to achieve?
Found a new nation based on democracy?
Well, it wasn't democracy, you know.
Right, not democracy.
What was he fighting against, really?
Involvement?
Hundreds of years later, the rest of the world took him up on it, but we were the first to recognize how evil something is. And the answer is colonialism. How does colonialism work? What makes it so evil?
It's manipulating the colonies and stealing basically all their resources and labor.
Yeah, you'll notice that these colonial nations never take over a barren land. They go to a rich place that has natural resources that they need. Understand? They steal the natural resources, bring it back to the mother country, where the mother country's industries make it into finished products, and then sell the finished products back to the colonies. In the meantime, the mother country doesn't allow the colonies to have industries that would compete with the mother country. That's what makes it so evil. And so Washington, basically, that's what he was fighting. If he was just fighting for the United States, then you could say, well, he just wanted to have his own country. But it was an ideal. Fighting for your own country is not an ideal, necessarily, if your country doesn't represent anything, right? Hitler was a great nationalist, wasn't he?
Yeah.
So fighting for your country only makes sense as an ideal if the country represents something noble. And what this country represented was war against imperialism. The first successful war against imperialism, trying to do away with these evil methods. Now, in order to win the war, he had to convince Americans to fight as a coherent and cohesive unit. And we've just described Americans as the most individualistic of all people that ever lived. And that wasn't so easy to do. So how was Washington able to convince Americans to fight as a cohesive unit? But by the way, they're farmers, and they're small farmers, which means if they go away to fight as recruits in the American colonial army, that means nobody's home to bring in the crop. And if there's no one home to bring in the crop, we're already going through this, it means you can't pay back the banks, and it means the banks take over your farm. Your wife and children can work hard, but by themselves, they're not going to be able to bring in the crops. So how do you convince Americans first to fight as a cohesive unit when they're individualistic? In general, but leave their farms behind and not leave, just fight from October to March. The British had a professional army. We had an army of recruits.
You pay them?
You have to convince them that the sacrifice they're going to make is worth it. That
So
this
you
is,
manipulate them?
well, in this case, his form of manipulation was to say, you can trust me. What I'm asking you to do is worthwhile. So the future of America is now based on the trustworthiness of George Washington. Because if anyone gets the faintest notion that George Washington is using them, manipulating them for his own selfish interests, there's no United States. And this is true while he's the general of the Continental Army, the commanding general. This also is true when he becomes President of the United States. The American people don't want to listen to anyone, they especially don't want to listen to government, only if they'll trust this person. He said, trust me. They did, and he proved to be trustworthy. And if he hadn't, there'd be no United States of America.
Wasn't he really funny about, like, real concerned with people's opinions of him and things like that for that reason? Because he wanted to be,
Completely
he wanted-
upstanding.
yeah,
Yeah, completely
like
He didn't-
virtuous or something.
He completely upstanding. He refused to allow for any compromise. So, for example, he didn't have two separate email accounts. So there you are. I guess we can also talk about, and then I'll hope you'll ask me questions. Remember we talked about how you set this lecture up, and there'll never be enough time to talk about all this stuff. 12 minutes later, it's all over. And now let's talk about Roosevelt and World War II. Roosevelt knew that Hitler was a megalomaniac. What is a megalomaniac? How do you spell it? M-E-G, A-L-O-M-A-N-I-A-C. What do you think that means?
A big, crazy, very crazy person.
It is a very big, but crazy, what makes it so crazy?
Illogical.
A megalomaniac is someone who wants to control the entire world. That's right. That's what makes it so crazy. You're absolutely right. So when Hitler starts knocking off all these European countries and starts moving into the Middle East and invading Russia, etc., Roosevelt has figured out that he's not going to be satisfied just controlling that part of the world. Next comes the United States. He also understood something about, what do you call it when somebody gets on a roll and then you're left behind and it's hard to make up the difference?
Momentum?
Yeah, he also understood something about momentum. That if the United States laid back and waited until Germany attacked us, it would be hard to gain the momentum to withstand his attack. He had developed all the weapons. So he has to convince the American people to join the fight against the Nazis long before the Nazis, and he's sure that this is about to happen. They're going to attack, defeat all of Europe, Asia, Middle East, and Africa, and attack the United States. But the American people, as individualistic as they are, as protective as they are of their sons, husbands, and brothers, and fathers, those mothers are not going to allow their sons to die in battle. They had just witnessed that during World War I, and they weren't going to let it happen again. So what was Roosevelt going to do? He knew, lacking momentum, that more American lives were going to be lost. More sons and brothers and fathers and husbands were going to die than if we took up the fight before they attacked us. But other Americans simply have an average kind of vision. It's hard for most people to see beyond their noses. It's hard for most average people to see into the future like that, forever. We're mostly, my son is sitting next to me now and I don't want to lose him. I'm not going to take a chance on his life. Roosevelt knows that less of your sons will die if we take the initiative and fight the Nazis now